Welcome back for our second panel. I want to extend my personal thanks to Michael Byers and the Center for Ethics, Law, and National Security for having invited me. My name is Charles-Philippe David. I am the director of the Center for U.S. Studies, as well as the chair of Strategic Studies at the University of Quebec at Montreal. And I'm co-chairing this year the Canadian Deputy Minister's seminar on Canada-U.S. relations. I will report back to them what I hear is interesting from today's and tomorrow's discussions. I'm very pleased to welcome on your behalf our four next panelists who will deal with and delve into counter-terrorism issues, the sujet du jour. With all the latest developments, it will keep us busy for a while. Counter-terrorism is one of the very many facets of changes that have affected Canada-U.S. relations in the last 3 years. A lot of work has been done, but much remains to be done. Border issues, as we have seen, are important. There are other issues that do affect the security relationship between Canada and U.S., and intelligence is one of the topics that will be raised this morning. Safety issues as well, health, food, pandemics, diseases, affect more and more the Canada-U.S. bilateral relationship. The assessment, as we saw in the first panel, the assessment of the threat keeps us very busy. And of course, specifically the Canadian counterterrorism policy needs to be better understood and better addressed. In 15 minutes or so, each of our panelists is going to delve into one of the issues I just laid out for you. By order of presentation, Ambassador Thomas McNamara, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs at the State Department and also former Ambassador to Colombia, will speak first on the changing nature of the terrorist threat. Then Wesley Wark, who is a professor at the History Department of the University of Toronto, frequent commentator in Canadian media on security issues, will go second and address the specific orientations of Canadian counterterrorism policies. Thirdly, Christopher Sands, who is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, frequent commentator as well on Canada-U.S. Political, diplomatic, and security issues, will present to us something perhaps much less known, which is the issue of intelligence sharing between Canada and U.S., a very, very important issue to fight against terrorism. And finally, Dr. Philip Edelman, taking over from the person who was announced, Mr. Sage, in the program, comes from the Health and Human Services Department. He works in the office of the Secretary. He is the medical advisor to the office of the Secretary, and we'll talk about pandemics, diseases, food, and health issues. So we should have a very interesting panel, 15 minutes each, and I will recall or remind each panelist when they're over with their 15 minutes. Thank you. Dr.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here at this conference, and I welcome the opportunity to talk bilaterally about issues which in fact are largely multilateral and international. But indeed, the U.S. and Canada have always had a relationship in which we look at our countries and indeed the continent with a very special perspective. Terrorism and counterterrorism are important. Not only are they the sujet du jour, but also de l'année and probably of a decade or more before we bring the issue down to the normal level that it has had over the past 20 or 30 years. I want to talk about the changing nature of the threat, at least as viewed from the United States. First of all, I want to remark that international terrorists are different from the homegrown variety, which most countries in the world have known some aspects of the homegrown variety. National terrorism, or even local or regional within a country, is a type of terrorism where national boundaries tend to contain the problem and the threat. By definition, international terrorism transcends those boundaries, and as a result, no one country, no one government, no one people are able to contain or control international terrorism. The nature of international terrorism is that it requires international cooperation. It cannot be contained by one nation alone, however strong that nation is. And we are faced, particularly in recent years, meaning the last 10, 15 years, even the last 20 or 30 years, but in particular the last dozen years, with terrorism on an international level, which is unprecedented in modern times. I can just cite New York and Washington and 9/11, Bali, the events going on in Russia, Kenya, the Philippines, Pakistan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. All of these demonstrate the international nature of this current threat. The challenge we face here today, therefore, speaking from the point of view of an American and a former diplomat, the challenge we face here today is finding effective common strategies against terror. Basically, it seems to me that every country must accept that homeland defense begins far beyond its borders. If we wait for the threat to arrive at the homeland and then try to defend, we've lost it. That applies to the United States, it applies to Canada, it applies to Europe, it applies to every country. Indeed, what America and the entire US effort does is going to increase the homeland security of Europeans, of Canadians, of Mexicans, and of others. And what Europe does is going to protect the homeland and assist in protecting the homeland of the United States, Canada, and others. It is not possible for any one country to deal with this changing threat. Let me turn, before talking about borders and then non-border elements in an overall approach to counterterrorism for the United States and Canada, let me talk about the changing nature of the threat, because I think it's very important to note what's happened in the post-2001 period with respect to the most important and most difficult and most dangerous of threats, and that is the threat of Islamic terror. Al-Qaeda, in the last few years, has followed a pattern that was not too well noticed in its early years of existence, and I would note that it's only been in existence about 15, 16, 18 years. Al-Qaeda has managed to mutate or to morph, to use a more current phrase, during the course of its 18 years in several different ways. It's had about 5 different phases. I want to focus on the last phase, which began about 1998, 1999, but really took effect in the post-2001 period and has resulted in a dramatic change in the way that Al-Qaeda operates and in the way Al-Qaeda is structured. In its earlier phases, it was a traditional guerrilla outfit. It then became much more focused on terror and began to develop cellular structures, did not have those in its first years. By the time it moved back into Afghanistan in the second half of the 1990s, in the middle of the 1990s, and then into the latter years of the 1990s, it had become largely a cellular structure, largely a terrorist organization, and it had lost almost all of its earlier guerrilla organizational structures. But it depended upon safe havens from its beginning until just after 2001. What happened in Afghanistan in 2001 and 2002 with the invasion is that it lost its territorial base, and it had to, once again, if it was to survive, and it did survive, and therefore it did, morph. It did mutate again to a different type of organization. It's still in the process of that mutation. It's still in the process of that reorganization. And I want to suggest that if we want to understand the new Al-Qaeda, we should take as a reference point what we do know and have known for many years about mafias. If we want to counter Al-Qaeda, we're going to have to turn to more counter-mafia type approaches. Because I want to suggest that what we are looking at in the new Al-Qaeda of post-2001 is a religious-based and a religiously motivated mafia organization. Much more difficult, much more dangerous than the old Al-Qaeda. Why is that? Well, first of all, because mafia organizations don't depend upon safe havens. By definition, the mafia doesn't have a safe haven. Whatever the mafia is, it's working within a civil society and an organization which deems it to be illegal, criminal, and therefore subject to repression. Secondly, mafias are decentralized in their control mechanisms. They're also locally developed and personalized, both with respect to their goals and objectives, but also with respect to their loyalties. So that local loyalties dominate in the mafia structure. In the case of Al-Qaeda, that's more and more the case. If you look at Bali and Madrid as the post-9/11 phenomena that are most commonly known, you'll see that they rely much more than in the pre-9/11 phase of Al-Qaeda's operations on local initiatives and on local personnel who have local loyalties and in fact are organized in cellular units that resemble the mafia family. That is to say, they're recruited locally. Their loyalty is to their local organization and, only in a more general sense, to the larger ideological society of which they participate in as local members. Whereas in the pre-9/11 phase, almost all of the Al-Qaeda operatives were trained at Al-Qaeda bases, swore loyalty in the inner circle to Osama bin Laden, and in the outer circle were simply useful fellow travelers. A much larger organization in the pre-9/11 phase than we see facing us today. But today's organization depends upon local recruitment, and it plays, for the most part, on local turf. That is to say, the Moroccans who lived in Spain carried out Madrid. The Indonesians carried out Bali. Not as in 9/11, where the incident was carried out by imported Al-Qaeda operatives. I'm not suggesting that the imported variety has ceased to exist. As I said, this transformation is only now in the process. And in the new, once it comes to an end, in this new organizational structure, there's plenty of room for the imported varieties. But we're going to see a lot more of the local variety playing on its home turf, and therefore much more capable of getting across borders or not even crossing borders to begin with. Where does the unity of the organization come from? Well, without the home base and without the international core that it relied upon in its early years, is going to have to come from its ideology and the religious beliefs of its members. This will be a little bit more difficult, it seems to me, to maintain over the long term, but it's nonetheless one that is possible to be maintained. Let me close. I could lead to the question and answer questions, because I'm sure this approach that I'm suggesting is quite, well, indeed it is controversial. I see here some similarities with the situation that I faced in Colombia over 15 years ago, when there were two so-called cartels which were broken up as a result of very effective action by the Colombians, by the United States, and by some of Colombia's neighbors. And what we saw was not an end to drug trafficking, but a splintering, an atomization of the structures, so that what you have in Colombia today are more localized units that conduct the drug trafficking. Because the larger units, those cartels so-called, were unable to function because of the pressure from the government and the pressure from outside the organizations that shattered them. I would suggest that we can see in Afghanistan that we succeeded in shattering the structure of Al-Qaeda without shattering Al-Qaeda. That is to say, just as drug trafficking continued after the end of the Cali and the Medellin cartel, we're going to see terrorism continue after Afghanistan. This suggests to me that although borders are important and necessary, they're just a first step, and they're not the answer to our security problem. The borders are, particularly between the United States and Canada and between the United States and Mexico, and I want to make this a North American vision or a North American approach, are always going to be porous. They're always going to be uncontrolled. I think the points made by Don McNamara and by Hugh Siegel on this is quite correct. We can't create any Maginot Lines, either between the United States and Canada or surrounding the North American entity. And this is particularly true if what I've just said about the changing nature of the threat is true. Because the borders, while they are important, are not, in fact, the place that we're going to be attacked. There will be an effort, as there always is in these asymmetrical attacks, to avoid the strong points and move against the weak points. The borders are a good place, however, to sort out people and cargo. It's what I call the necessary first step, where one has to find the needles in the haystack. And it seems to me the best way to find needles in haystacks is to reduce the size of the haystacks. And the way you do that is, in many cases at the border, by prior identification of the hay and putting it off to one side, in a sense, using technology and other mechanisms, particularly passports, visas, border crossing cards, which use high technology so that they require fewer resources. That frees up the resources to look for the needles. If we continue to play around with the hay, we're never going to get around to seeing the needles. In short, removing the shoes of every passenger who gets on a plane is a very ineffective and inefficient way to control our borders. What we need to do, it seems to me, on the border issue is to work towards risk management, reducing the haystack. This means better intelligence. Not only do we have to know thine enemy, we also have to know thy friends. And the better we are at identifying the friends, the better we are going to be at identifying the enemy. That knowledge in the intelligence can instruct us and can make our defenses and our offenses, when they're required, much more effective actions. Advanced sorting, absolutely essential, and the use of technology. Also, we have to develop the institutionalized mechanisms, which is pointed out by Ms. Jewell. They're underway with respect to the borders, but we have to do a lot more to develop these institutions. And in particular, we have to develop them with Canada. Let me now talk 2 more minutes, fine. That will give me plenty to leave over for the question and answer period. Non-border aspects of our overall approach to counterterrorism. As I said at the beginning, one country's homeland security is another country's counterterrorism, and vice versa. And because international terrorism is so different, we do, in fact, have to look at it as a very special phenomenon. It seems to me that we need concentric circles of defense in the counterterrorism area to be effective. It's not just borders, although they are indeed important, but local, regional, and national efforts are going to have to be undertaken. If I'm right about the local nature of the recruiting and of the organization of the cells in various countries, then it's going to mean that local authorities and regional authorities within a particular country are going to have to be engaged in order for success in counterterrorism to be achieved. But also, beyond the national, which is well developed at this juncture, or at least more well developed than the regional local, there are bilateral and trilateral here in North America and multilateral international efforts that need to be undertaken. That is to say, those concentric circles have to go beyond the national, have to go beyond US and Canada. There needs to be a trilateral circle of North America, including Mexico, because the borders with Mexico are every bit as porous, and indeed in many respects more porous and less controlled than the border between the United States and Canada, simply because control mechanisms within Mexico are less well developed than here in the United States and in Canada. Cross-border mechanisms among the three are very important if we're going to get that third or that trilateral circle and in the concentric circle metaphor to work. Intel cooperation, police cooperation, cooperation on alert mechanisms. Very important, because an alert called in the United States that is not effectively complemented by one in Canada or vice versa, or in Mexico, is not going to be as effective as one that is called for the entire North American area. Not all the same level of alert, but nonetheless an alert mechanism that is coordinated. Much as they're trying to develop in Europe, we need to develop one here. And finally, incident response cooperation. We must assume that at some point or another, there's going to be another major incident. And if the incident response mechanism is trilateral and not just national or local and regional, it's going to be more effective. It seems to me that a trilateral approach here in North America, in which we don't try and abolish the borders so much as we try to create a perimeter which deals jointly and cooperatively with what is outside the US, Canada, and Mexico. But at the same time, because of the changing nature of the threat that I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to have to be very, very careful about what happens inside that perimeter. And I think too much focus in recent years, last year or so, 2 years, has been on making sure that the borders are secure, as opposed to making sure that the societies are secure. And also too much emphasis on this perimeter idea. The morphing of the threat means we have to morph ourselves. We have to be as flexible as Al-Qaeda if we're going to be able to respond effectively to the threat, which I think now is going to be not just from beyond that perimeter, but is going to be inside the perimeter at the same time. And I'll end with that, and I hope I stayed within my 15 minutes.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about Canadian counterterrorism policy. And I'm going to start by flourishing two defining images, both popular culture ones. The first is a brand name, the second is a cartoon. The brand name is this: Canada as terrorist safe haven. There have been various efforts since September 11th to stamp this brand name on Canada. Library of Congress, Congressional Research Service report, among the more sillier attempts, report by the Nixon Center. It's a sometimes favorite comment by Senator Hillary Clinton. It's in the air, and I think it is wholly false. But it's not going to go away. It's probably going to be fueled again, this brand name, by the release of the famous August 6, 2001 President's Daily Brief, the CIA report to the President, which suggested, for those of you who have seen it, and it's been released as a result of the 9/11 Commission's inquiries and the White House's rather reluctant decision, contains in its second paragraph the suggestion that a Canadian by the name of Ahmed Rassam, who's in fact Algerian-born, and who attempted to take a bomb that he built in Vancouver to the United States across the border in order to engage in a Millennium attack targeted against the Los Angeles airport. The suggestion in the CIA's PDB was that Ahmed Rassam and this Canadian attack was probably meant to be the first wave of Al-Qaeda strikes directly targeted against the United States. I think, to be honest, that CIA assessment was probably wholly wrong. And if Ahmed Rassam was the best that Al-Qaeda could do in 1999, we could only have wished that there were more of him out there. They did much better on September 11th. The terrorist safe haven brand name, though, is one that we have to confront both in Canadian and American discussions of Canada's counterterrorism capabilities. We have to confront it and set it aside. The second defining image that I want to suggest to you comes from the New Yorker magazine, which has done, I think, wonderful reporting on some of these issues since September 11th. And it's a cartoon which I wish I had saved, but I didn't in the press of events. It featured an encounter between a man and a woman, presumably at a New York cafe of some kind, in which the man leans over the table in an intimate fashion and whispers to the woman, "You look strangely familiar. You must be Canadian." I think there's something to this concept of strangely familiar, which is going to be a bit of my theme today. Strangely familiar, I think, should be the better approximation to how we understand Canadian policy in a Canadian-American context and in the broader context of global war on terrorism. We don't have time here to list all the ways in which Canadian policy since September 11th has had strangely familiar dimensions, that is, ways in which Canadian practices and new innovations since September 11th have mirrored American ones or have been developed in parallel or have followed on American practice. But let me just give you a very, very brief list, and if people are curious to pursue any of these, we can talk about it in the Q&A. First off, of course, the Canadian decision, in effect, to join in a global war on terrorism, reached very quickly after September 11th, which was followed up by military support in Afghanistan, sending of Canadian troops, and virtually the entire operational element of the Canadian Navy went to the region after September 11th. Then we had our omnibus anti-terrorism legislation, Bill C-36, debated in the fall of 2001, passed in December 2001, a very significant, very powerful piece of legislation, which is the Canadian equivalent, in effect, of your Patriot Act. In December 2001, we also had the passage of a mini-security budget by our then Finance Minister, Paul Martin, who is now returned as Canadian Prime Minister. The security budget didn't get a whole lot of attention, but it was absolutely unprecedented in Canadian history. In December 2001, Paul Martin promised an expenditure of $7.7 billion over the course of 5 years to improve Canadian capacities in the national security field. There's never been in our history an expenditure of that kind targeted on those kinds of issues, and the money has now been increased in recent announcements to $8.3 billion. This is a whole lot of money. I remember being on a national news program and asked the question, nothing much new there. We just don't get some of these initiatives. Also in December 2001, the Smart Border Declaration was arrived at between Canada and the United States. been talked about by previous panelists. In 2002, we went through a fairly significant reform of our immigration legislation. And most recently, in December 2003, with the coming into power of the new Paul Martin government, a series of very significant institutional reforms announced to security intelligence practice, including the creation of a permanent Canadian cabinet committee to deal with public safety issues, the creation of a post of national security advisor, which we've never had in Canadian context, the creation of a parliamentary committee to review Canadian practices in this field, a whole host of other measures. To sum all this up, I think it has three dimensions, and it must be said that Canadian practice in terms of counterterrorism policy writ large has been responsive and evolving, and it hasn't followed any obvious strategic plan. We've had one dimension of these activities in Canada since September 11th has been our military role, focused on Afghanistan, first with Operation Enduring Freedom, and then subsequently with Canadian support to the NATO-led Operation Athena in Kabul. There has secondly been the always important dimension of money. A great deal of money is now being devoted by the Canadian government to, broadly speaking, to Canadian counterterrorism policies and practices. And thirdly and finally, and relatedly it must be said, there are underway some very significant measures of institutional reform in the way in which the Canadian government handles terrorist threats, the way it handles intelligence, the way it handles responses. Hugh Siegel, I don't think he's here, mentioned in the first session that he was skeptical about these institutional reforms, and institutional reforms can be the last, he is here, so maybe this will bring a smile to his face, the last recourse of scoundrels in government, clearly. But I would disagree with him on this because I think that if you look at the Canadian context in terms of the government arrangements in place, if you like, for intelligence and security matters, they were so incapable of confronting the nature of post-September 11 threats that institutional reforms were absolutely necessary. We may not have arrived at the best model, but something had to be done, and my concern is about the belatedness of these reforms rather than the fact that they've taken place. So, military intervention, spending, institutional reform have all been there in the Canadian context, and they have all stimulated some degree of public debate, though the debate has suffered from one fact that perhaps those who have taken part in it have not always concentrated on, but it's very hard to debate things that are a moving target. It's very hard to debate in a kind of fog. The Canadian fog is created by two perhaps unique conditions for Canada in its relationships with the United States. One is that we have no equivalent of the American National Security Strategy document of September 2002. We have as yet no government-inspired agreed framework for how Canada is going to function in a 21st century world of threats in an anti-terrorism context. Secondly, the Canadian fog is created in part, the fog of war is created in part because, of course, Canada hasn't been directly attacked by Al-Qaeda yet. And we are naturally hopeful north of the border that we will never be attacked. This has led to some considerable degree of confusion about the nature of the threat to Canada, about Canada's role in the global anti-terrorism war. And again, it hasn't been helped by the fact that we have suffered from the lack of government-inspired thinking and strategizing on this issue. The stimuli behind the various measures of reform and change and innovation that have taken place in Canada is often in the public mind accredited to, this is part of Canadian delight, if you like, in conspiracy theory, accredited to American pressure of various kinds, or accredited to a desire, for various reasons, to politics or economics, to stay very close to U.S. practice and therefore perform as an ally. I don't regard those as the major kinds of stimuli, in fact, behind the various very significant steps that Canada has taken since September 11th to confront the security environment. It's nevertheless very difficult to know what really is at the heart of all of these significant changes and new policies. But one of the things that stands out for me is this, that on September 11th, Canada suffered an intelligence failure. Now, all Americans in the audience will be familiar with this concept, and you were all engaged in a fascinating debate at the moment about the nature of that intelligence failure. We've never had such a debate in Canada, and the notion that Canada suffered an intelligence failure would strike people as rather an odd remark to make. Canada wasn't attacked. After all, how did we suffer an intelligence failure? Let me just explain this for a minute, because the failure is an important thing to understand in terms of the shock that it inflicted on the Canadian government. We suffered an intelligence failure in the obvious sense that the Canadian government and its various intelligence and security agencies had no prior knowledge of the September 11th attacks. I think that's very clear from the public reporting that has taken place on that. We didn't know from our own sources, and we didn't know in the context of the intelligence alliance of which we are a part, and which dates back to the Second World War, always loosely referred to as the Yakuza Pact. But Canada is very closely linked to the United States, Great Britain, and Australia as our principal intelligence gathering partners. A great deal of sharing of intelligence information circulates among those states in a community and with a chemistry that is established over long decades. We didn't know from our own sources, we didn't know from our intelligence allies that September 11th was going to happen. So a double shock, too, in the sense that it made the government of Canada wonder, probably really seriously for the first time, just what were our intelligence capabilities when it came to terrorism. It also made the Canadian government wonder just how effective was its traditional reliance on intelligence allies going to be in the future. The second dimension of the intelligence failure of September 11th was that it raised questions about whether the attack might have been launched from Canada. No one knew for sure in the days immediately after September 11th whether some or all of the hijackers might have come across the Canadian border. The plot might have been formulated in Canada. This was a Canadian fear. And Canadians among you will remember the fear. If you remember those days, Americans might find it a rather odd one. But that was the Canadian fear at the time. It was an unlikely fear in that you only have to ask yourself why Al-Qaeda would have bothered to add to their difficulties in mounting such an operation by crossing the Canadian border in large numbers. But nevertheless, eventually proved to be a fear unfounded. But it left a lasting impression, I would argue, on the Canadian government, which is that it raised the hypothetical possibility that although September 11th wasn't mounted from Canada, a future September 11th could be, and what would we know about it. And the third dimension of the intelligence failure that hit home, I think, was the recognition that while the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, our principal domestic security intelligence agency, had been engaged in the study of terrorist activities in Canada for a number of years, and it made it, in fact, their principal priority for several years before September 11th. Nevertheless, the September 11th attacks did raise the possibility that such an attack could happen in the future in Canada. So I would argue that a significant stimuli, at least, to many of the changes that have come over Canadian policy since September 11th do not come from without. They come from within, and they come from the resonance of the shock of September 11th in a particular Canadian context. One of the problems that we've confronted in trying to erect a strong counterterrorism capability since September 11th, I think has been relatively invisible until very, very recently. And this is the thing I want to focus on for the rest of my remarks. It was highlighted, in fact, by the Auditor General's recent report, which I mentioned in the question, and which I commend to all of you as a factual study of Canadian strengths in counterterrorism. It's on their Auditor General's website. Now, the problem is this, that to be effective in counterterrorism, the country has to have a very strong capacity to learn lessons from the past. I don't just say this as a historian in this kind of party pre-announcement, but I think it's a truth. And it's a lesson, I think, that would not come as unfamiliar to the British or Americans, but it's one that Canada has great difficulty, it seems, taking on board. We are bad at learning lessons. But the very best way in which we could create an effective counterterrorism policy is to learn lessons. The Auditor General's report, just very briefly, called attention to two things that I wasn't aware of, and which I found the most shocking security lapse listed in that report. One was that Canada had made no systematic effort to learn lessons from the Ahmed Rassam case, our most dangerous example of Al-Qaeda operations in Canada to date. Second, and even more shocking fact, was that the Canadian government made no systematic effort to learn lessons from September 11th. You cannot have an effective counterterrorism policy unless you can learn lessons from your own experiences and from the experiences of your allies. And this is going to be increasingly, I think, important for us. I'm going to finish before 2 minutes. Increasingly important for us because I think the audience may have got a bit of a flavor of this. On some key issues, Canada and the United States, at least for the moment, is drifting further and further apart, notably the Iraq War. It's very important for Canada in creating an effective counterterrorism policy and strategy to be able to learn lessons not only from its own experience, but also from the experience of its allies. The greater the drift, the greater the distance between Canada and the US on certain key international security policy issues, the greater the possibility arises of the obscuring effect of anti-Americanism in Canadian thinking, and the greater the difficulty becomes in learning hard and realistic lessons from the American experience. Why do lessons matter? One, just to reiterate, we're never going to create an effective security and intelligence community in Canada unless we can do this on a systematic basis. Secondly, until we begin to learn lessons, I don't think that a message which is still unfamiliar to Canadian government ears won't really hit home. The message is this, that although many people would like to seize this position, the truth is that intelligence is the first line of defense in a transnational war on terrorism. And the third reason why we have to learn lessons is that without that capacity, we're never going to achieve, we're never going to succeed in what we're trying to do in Canada, rather belatedly at the moment, which is to create a national and international security policy. Government has promised to come out with these policies and are engaged in internal reviews at the moment. And finally, let me say that I agree with Daniel Thrash on this, that learning lessons is not just a government business, it's also a public business, a public right and a public responsibility. We're never going to have the possibility of learning lessons in public in Canada until we embrace this notion of the need to do so, and until Canada gets over its traditional culture of secrecy that surrounds some of these issues. So Canadian counterterrorism policy, this is my conclusion, is and should look strangely familiar to Americans. But unfortunately, it looks strangely familiar still to Canadians.
Thank you very much. I wish I had a little bit of an interlude. Maybe we should make Philip go first, because then I could scramble some more notes down. That was a great presentation. Let me say I also enjoyed Daniel's presentation this morning, and I wanted, it kind of caught me. He has this new book out, and a couple of years ago there were some of us who worked on a book. This was in 2000. I guess we were more optimistic then. We were writing a book about Canada-US relations, and we decided on a title. We decided to call it Vanishing Borders. away. And we had a nice picture of Bill Clinton opening the USMC in Ottawa. Ambassador Giffen helped to make that a very photogenic event for us to put on the cover. This is terrific. Sold well on Amazon, did okay in Canadian bookstores. Barnes & Noble, no problem. But somehow, we didn't sell very many through Borders. And I thought to myself, well, maybe it was the title. And I have to say, Daniel has solved the problem by coming up with a book and saying, Borders Matter. Boy, that should sell very well. So I'm going to watch his sales. Smart man. It also, though, and if I sound nostalgic for 2000, I want to flash back to that moment, because I think that sometimes when you have an event like September 11th, it causes you to reinterpret everything looking back, and sometimes you think everything that happened before that moment doesn't matter to us now. Everything's changed, the world's changed, therefore it's a whole new set of assumptions. But if you ask most Canadians, and I think a lot of Americans who live along the Canada-US border before September 11th, what was really driving our future, our lives, what was the most important thing happening in our North American space? It was economic integration. Economic integration that began decades ago, that was accelerated by Canada-US free trade, accelerated further by NAFTA, that was beginning to link us together more and more closely. And as a result of that integration, we went from a period when I think we could talk about Canadians here in the United States as our neighbors, to a period where really, in a lot of ways, they were roommates of ours. I know there's some college students here. Everybody remembers some sort of college experience where you share a room or an apartment with somebody, and you realize that because you're in the same space, the rules are a bit different. You have to negotiate. If somebody likes to keep the window open when they're sleeping and you freeze, you have to negotiate some terms on that because you're both affected. If you have to study for an exam and somebody brings home a bunch of drunken fools, you're not going to get any studying done. You have to find a way to talk about those problems or move out. The only problem with our apartment in North America is we can't move out, really. So we have to find ways to talk about how integration makes us intervulnerable, to use a word that is common for academics, but maybe not so common when you talk about security. My topic today is to talk a little bit about intelligence, and I go back to this growing integration of the world before September 11th because we began really changing the way in which we dealt with intelligence information and the way we shared information between not just the CIA and the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, but between law enforcement agencies, going all the way back into the early 90s and beyond that in some cases. But the 90s were a particularly important period. Some of you will remember that in 1994, when we were debating NAFTA, we were also debating reforming our customs and immigration laws. And as we engaged in that debate in the United States, Congress really felt that reform of customs and immigration would be an important precondition to NAFTA for fear that there would be a wave of people coming across the border. Look at what had happened with Canada-US trade, how it boomed after we signed the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. So in the years after the passage of NAFTA, the two governments began looking at some of the problems that more open borders created. One of the first things to be discussed in 1997 was smuggling. If you're an economist at all, you tend to know that if prices are higher in one jurisdiction and prices are lower in another, and there's no reason not to cross the border and shop, people will tend to go for the cheaper goods. I live in Virginia, and I have to always dodge the shoppers on the weekends who come down because our cigarette tax is very low. We're the home of Philip Morris, and so we only charge, I think, 2 cents a pack or a carton or something like that. So people come and buy cigarettes in Virginia. Sometimes Canadians, for a while, they felt the tax, when the GST was imposed on top of the manufacturer sales tax in Canada, people felt that was because manufacturer sales tax applied to inventories. People felt prices were too high, so they cross-border shop. There's a normal passage, and of course smuggling is really organized crime taking advantage of that and beginning to move goods back and forth across the border. The two countries are concerned about not only the smuggling of goods, but the smuggling of people, the smuggling of firearms. We take different regulatory approaches to handguns. And so many of the handguns used in the commission of crimes in Canada actually come from Detroit or Buffalo or by way of Detroit or Buffalo. So Canadians wanted to engage with the Americans on this. The Americans wanted to engage with the Canadians on it. We also launched a Northeast Border Working Group to talk about some of the broader issues, not only of smuggling of goods, but also drugs. Very constructive. These discussions, which were started, led us to a discussion of a border vision initiative, where the two countries began talking in 1997 about what kind of a future border we wanted. And the vision that came out of that 1997 discussion was a vision of managing the risk at the border, something that Ted McNamara talked about, risk management. If we could share intelligence and information about shipments of goods, about the origin of those goods, about what we knew about movement of people across the border, we could focus our resources where we felt the risk was highest. Those things that were, I guess this is the Don Rumsfeld explanation that we have the known knowns, the unknown knowns, and the unknown unknowns. If we only knew more than we did, then we would be able to judge the risk and we'd have a better border management system. And that really animated discussions at the Cross-Border Crime Forum, which Linda Jewell mentioned, which has continued ever since and was an extremely important opportunity for law enforcement people to talk together about smuggling, about drugs, and about how they could work better together. And out of that dialogue, we got integrated border enforcement teams. The idea that we could create task forces, much as we do in the United States between federal and state and local law enforcement, we could create them across the border. Everyone has something to bring to the table. We can share intelligence. We can do background checks, anything, trying to get evidence so that we can bring criminal activity to a halt. The integrated border enforcement teams that came out of that cross-border crime forum really instigated a great deal of intelligence sharing. Now, it's not intelligence as you think of it in sort of the Cold War, little envelope crossing through Checkpoint Charlie from one side of the wall to the other, but in a much more normal way. Information about bad guys, information about criminal activity, information about suspected crimes. Some of you will remember, I was living along the border working for the state of Michigan after Canada's free trade, that there was this period when our friends in customs were, I think, a little worried. Around Detroit, we all talked about how great it was. We had Canada's free trade. Those customs guys would go away. Not only did they not appreciate that, their union didn't appreciate it, and so they began talking about all the good things customs can do for you when they check you at the border, and so they began talking about non-custodial parents who might take a kid across the border and try to live on the other side and, with the kid, and then change their names and so on and so forth. And this is a great topic for Reader's Digest and other magazines. Had a lot of people thinking, well, yeah, it's good that we have a checkpoint there. But this meant that even in terms of family law, in terms of domestic arrangements, in terms of information about citizens who might be doing something that we wouldn't think of as organized crime, as just individuals doing things, this became the purview of the border and increased our intelligence sharing. And we even established, very significantly, a Pacific Northwest Joint Crime Center to actually look more broadly. In that case, they were concerned about trans-Pacific crime with some of the Asian gangs and not only drug running, but human smuggling. And we found that when we got together, we actually had a chance to exchange a lot of information and learn a great deal. Now, why spend so much time talking about that evolution? Because on September 11, or shortly after, as we started talking about smart border declarations, they came from someplace. Not the genius of someone who thought of them up on the spur of the moment, but on an evolution that was driven for us by economic integration of thinking around the exchange of information in order that we would know better the risks we face and we could counter them more effectively. And the Smart Border Action Plan, the 30 points, really builds on that. No, something like, okay. It builds on this notion of exchanging information. And it really has caused us, in the first instance, to make those exchanges of information more formalized and more natural for both sides. Some of you will remember before Bill C-36, Bill C-34 in Canada, which was a major immigration reform, had been in the works a long time, but introduced for Canadians the notion that, as a matter of course, in difficult refugee matters when you're trying to verify identity, there would be recourse to international intelligence information about individuals so that you could do a more complete background check. That includes U.S. intelligence information, which is important. We would increase the resources for our joint operations. And this spirit was then carried on into our Department of Homeland Security. Just to speak briefly about some of the structures that are in place, some of you will know that one of the 4 big directorates in the Department of Homeland Security is a Directorate for Information Analysis and Infrastructure Protection. It pulls together different parts of the U.S. government, legacy of commerce, the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office, legacy of the old GSA, the Federal Computer Incident Response Center, legacy of the FBI, the National Infrastructure Protection Center, and a legacy of the Defense Department, the National Communications System, to begin pulling information together to try to pull it into a form where you're actually cross-checking things. You're right, we're talking about the 9/11 Commission and the discussions that they've had in the last couple of weeks have been illuminating, but the Department of Homeland Security really tried to address how can we pull information that's known by different parts of the government together. What's significant about this for our current discussion is that this pulling together of information also created a model for pulling the counter-U.S. information together. There was no Chinese wall between Canadian and American intelligence. We were sharing information, we were talking to one another about all of the aspects of the terror threat in the days after September 11, and we regularized those contacts. We regularized that communication. Another, the important directorate, it's the one that Canadians know best, I think, the Department of Homeland Security, is Border and Transportation Security. And in all of the major sections of that bureau, there are intelligence officers, officers of intelligence, people looking at the data. And parallel to the national security strategy of the United States, which was mentioned earlier, there's another important document, which is the United States National Strategy for Homeland Security, which talks about the need not to create new intelligence gathering, first and foremost, not to create a new spy agency within DHS, as some suggested, as sort of MI5, but to make sure that we were independently looking at that data with fresh eyes, that we had another look from the perspective of protecting our homeland, from the perspective of worrying about domestic counterterrorism here in the United States. This is one area where I think we've really improved Canada-U.S. intelligence cooperation. The American side is now paying much more attention to what it hears from Canada. It has the structures to do so. It has the structures to receive that intelligence. People are reading reports and able to say, you know, that raises some questions for me. Let me follow up and ask some more questions. The Canadian intelligence that's set down doesn't go into a dead letter box. It doesn't go into one ombudsperson who then has to filter out who gets which, you know, where I'll make 6 photocopies and round it around the office. People have direct access to Canadian law enforcement. They have direct access to Canadian intelligence on a need-to-know basis. They at least have the ability to start asking, and they have the structures to start bringing that into U.S. decision-making, which is very important. And we have extant ongoing communication between FBI and RCMP, between the CIA and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Now, all of that has improved the flows of information, the volumes. I think it's improved the quality of the attention that the U.S. pays to Canadian intelligence. But we still have problems. And I want to just close on the problems, because I think that they're important for us now, because all of this good cooperation I don't think can be taken as a given indefinitely. Particularly, and you saw in the first panel, given the kind of debate that we're having between Canada and the United States these days. First, the quality of information that we're gathering we think is better than it used to be, but some of what we used to have that's still in the system can be misleading. And sometimes we find that the information that we're trying to make a decision on just isn't very good intelligence information. There's no way to know sometimes whether a piece of intelligence is good. Usually you try to verify it with multiple sources. But just because it's intelligence doesn't mean it's always accurate. And we've done a lot to improve the accuracy of the information we have on people, but there's still some challenges there. And since there's so much information flowing back and forth, the benefit is that we're cross-checking against each other's sources. The challenge is to improve the quality as we move forward so we don't have more error incidents or other incidents where people get caught and there's a questionable basis for them getting caught in a security net, and yet the consequences are quite severe. This is inevitably, I think, leading us to another big concern, which is the concern over privacy. Whenever you talk about moving information, particularly intelligence information, back and forth, naturally people raise concerns about what information about them is in the system, what information is being exchanged. Now, the Department of Homeland Security has made privacy a priority, as privacy officers in various units of that department, including in the U.S. Visit Office, writing privacy plans, talking to our allies about how that information is being safeguarded and the uses to which it will be put. One reason the administration is very seized of the importance of guarding privacy, one reason that Congress talks a lot about the importance of having privacy legislation to set those parameters out so that law enforcement knows what the boundaries are, is that both in Canada and the United States we have very mature legal systems and judges, and all we need is one case where someone misapplies intelligence or uses it in a way which on reflection doesn't seem justified, and you open the possibility that a court will decide how much information can be shared, the nature of information that can be shared. Better to have that debate between officials in two governments, better to have that debate within legislatures than to be surprised that a court has decided that you can't share the information that you thought you could share. Why? Because the whole premise of the smart border is that we can define people as low risk because we know enough about them that we know that they're not risky, and we focus our resources where we think the risk is greatest. If, moving down the road, Canada, the United States, or a Canadian court in particular, feels that the information that has been shared has been used in a bad way, they'll put up a Chinese wall. John Ashcroft talked yesterday about U.S. intelligence agencies being blinded to their own intelligence information. There's no reason we couldn't be blinded to what's known in Canada by courts that say, that you misused this information in the past, you can't be trusted in the future. And it's a real concern, because the smart border has allowed the United States to focus its resources in other areas. The cost of building up a border based not on trust but on mistrust would be astronomical. I know we're talking about astronomical sums in budgeting these days, but it's a lot of money to try to turn this border into a more rigid, more security check border. And for all the worries about security checks since 9/11, the border has really stayed open, and information has flowed back and forth, people flow back and forth to a remarkable degree. The next area I want to highlight that I think is an area of concern is corporate data. One of the things that we've talked about a little bit earlier today when we were talking about the border is the Free and Secure Trade Program, the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, its predecessor. Companies are sharing a great deal of information with the government in order that their shipments of goods be designated low risk, in order that they can get the best possible access across the border. It makes sense. They have a lot of information to share. They have an interest in sharing it. But corporations have a great deal of data about us. They have a great deal of data about people crossing the border. And I think that the desire on the corporate side to cooperate with the government, because they've been very good allies with the U.S. and the Canadian government in the war on terrorism, has already begun to create a somewhat of a two-tiered border. This is, for those of you who remember, a return to the world of the Auto Pact, not the world of Canada's free trade, a world in which we had different types of people crossing the border. In the Auto Pact days, we had auto companies that had a special deal, and then we had everyone else who had to face tariffs and extra problems. On security, I think that we're increasingly finding that those who are willing to either volunteer their information through a program like Nexus, or those who are willing to join a program like ZTPAT and share a great deal of information will have better access than people who don't provide that information so that the customs people can't decide whether they're a risk or not. That is all being fueled, I think. I think part of the danger there is that people don't want to give their information to the government. They're nervous about how it's going to be treated at the border. And that comes back to my very last point, because I know I'm down to 30 seconds, if not 22. And that is that our debate has become quite poisoned, I think, particularly on the Canadian side. Anti-Americanism, combined with a resistance to economic integration, which has been there since Canada-US free trade was debated. Some Canadians will say it's been there going all the way back to reciprocity in 1911, is a powerful emotional argument in Canada. And anti-Americanism, after NAFTA, seemed to be sort of drifting in Canada. But it now has an agenda. And its agenda has attached to issues like privacy and homeland security to push back immigration. Borders are the first line of defense for nationalists who don't want more immigration. And we have created now a debate that's so poisonous and so poorly informed that there are a lot of people who simply default to distrust. And that's going to undermine all of the good work that we've done in the days since September 11th. So while I think that our intelligence cooperation and sharing is very good now, I don't think we can count on it staying that way unless we can find a way to address this anti-American argument in Canada and push back against it by telling people what we're doing and being more informative about the uses of information. And more importantly, going back to the earlier point, making sure that the way in which we handle intelligence information across this border would pass a transparency test, is reassuring, so that we don't have court intervention. We can do this in a fair and just way for both sides. Thanks very much.
I think I've just been given a 2-minute warning. Thank you and good morning. Mr. Sage was unable to attend this meeting and frankly emailed me last week asking whether I could come. And I frankly went through my schedule, moving things around, was able to tell him 36 hours ago the answer was yes, at which point I found out what the meeting was. It was at the law school, and to expect a large number of lawyers in the audience. So that was my intelligence failure. But I want to suggest that from the public health standpoint, we look at terrorism as an all-hazards approach, whether it's bio, whether it's chemical, radiological, mass trauma, but also whether it's unintentional, whether it's a tornado or a hurricane or whatever. And the important point here, I think, is that a good public health infrastructure serves our counterterrorism approaches. I do want to mention another very serious intelligence failure, one that may not be recognized as such per se. And I was moved from the CDC Atlanta to Washington in January of '03 to assist in the department efforts and to act as liaison. And at that point, we were gearing up for potential problems associated with the impending war in Iraq. Around February or March of '03, we began to recognize that there was a serious problem and intelligence failure. And that intelligence failure began with events in November of '02 in Asia and became known to Western world in February or March. And that was the recognition of a new disease, an outbreak which became known as SARS. Subsequent cases from Asia were transported by air carrier, taking victims of the disease to Vancouver and subsequently Toronto, and later to the United States. Unfortunately, in Canada, there were several deaths and hospital spread amongst workers of the disease. Being a new and unknown disease at that time in humans, there was uncertainty as the mechanism, how the disease spread, what the actual organism was, and that took actually a miraculously small amount of time, a matter of weeks, to come up with the recognized agent of SARS, and actually to come up with a laboratory test for confirmation. If you remember, there were many people who had other respiratory illnesses or flus at the time, and it was extremely mind-boggling trying to sort out what was a true case versus a non-SARS case. So what were the effects of interventions were also precluded by the fact that we did not have very good information about the inception of SARS. We didn't know how it spread in China. We didn't know what the risk factors were. We didn't know the timing of spread. All of these things are critical to public health interventions in infectious disease. Since then, issues such as avian flu recently, mad cow disease, monkeypox, and a series of other infectious diseases and other problems affecting either humans or agricultural animals have come to the forefront. Our planning for counterterrorism actually served us well, I think, in these later endeavors. And when we did some introspection at CDC and recognized that our communications to the public and with others was not very good during the anthrax outbreaks in '01, we took rather drastic steps to try and change that. One of which was Secretary Thompson's creation of a significant communications command center for HHS in order to communicate with CDC as well as other health establishments worldwide. This was extremely important in the SARS epidemic and response, in which we could have daily video conferences with Health Canada, with WHO, with other partners involved, and have robust discussions on science and ways forward on a daily, sometimes twice daily basis. Also in November of 2002, meetings held in Ottawa amongst a variety of allies, the G7 countries plus Mexico, the European and the World Health Organization, the European Union and the World Health Organization, created a Global Health Security Action Group to look at how we could work together on a variety of infectious disease and other related problems that could face us in a terrorist event. Some of the impact of what is now referred to as the Ottawa Plan, with Canada as the Secretariat, involved cooperation on the development and acquisition of vaccines and other medical countermeasures. And with new countermeasures is the need to monitor adverse effects, which again gets into privacy issues, databases, sharing of information across the borders. But we need to know what those adverse effects may be and how to monitor those. This also leads to issues of indemnification. Part of the problems that we had with smallpox vaccination was we're asking workers, under potentially workers' compensation statutes, to be vaccinated voluntarily with unclear methods of compensation should they become ill. We needed to share our response plans. We need to share traditional public health surveillance information. So that if we saw what looked like the beginning of an outbreak either in a border community, metropolitan area, or elsewhere, how do we identify this? How do we compare and see whether other countries, particularly those bordering the United States, are having similar problems? And how do we bring these together with similar and common definitions that can be used for action? Subsequent meetings in December between Secretary Ridge of the Department of Homeland Security and Deputy Prime Minister Manley further identified public health issues for strengthening and cooperating. The effects of smart borders on public health planning became important as well. Several initiatives were developed for response, as well as science and technology issues, such as sensing devices, but also several initiatives on food safety. Laboratory cooperation has been an extremely important issue. Now, laboratory cooperation is important because we're often doing tests that are not so simple as a blood count or a chest x-ray. We're doing tests on new infectious diseases, on select agent materials, on difficult to identify chemicals, and a whole group of other things. The importance of this is, as we saw in SARS, we have to have the same base of information. When any country says we have a case of SARS and it's been laboratory confirmed, the rest of the world has to have confidence that that laboratory confirmation is valid and true in order to make your assessments and to also judge the adequacy of interventions. Which means we need to be able to share methods, technology, references, standards, and if you're going to validate methods, you may have to share, in some capacity, the actual agents themselves to make sure you get the same results. Therefore, we have to be assured in passing such information that it is secure, and if actual agents are transferred, that those comport with international requirements, and also that the facilities to which they are going have proper security in place. Not just for security in terms of is this the right laboratory, can they handle it, or is this going to get out in the community, but is this a safe facility for storage of these materials? As you can see, or assume, more and more of the tasks or goals that come to my desk now under the action plan, have this item that lists obtain legal counsel for liaison. Now, before I came to the federal government several months before 9/11, I spent several decades in academic and private medicine, delivering care and seeing patients. And it was my absolute goal to absolutely avoid, under any circumstances, having to talk to a lawyer. So the paradigm has now changed. Under food, other issues of cooperation need to be brought to bear. This included how do you inspect food coming across the border? How do you know your shipper to be sure that the shipping methodology and everything else is consistent, not just with natural outbreaks of foodborne illness, but to thwart terrorist efforts that may occur. Again, food laboratories are a very different subset of public health labs. And again, cooperation on standards, validation, testing, methodologies, et cetera, for food is also very important from the standpoint of health, as well as from the standpoint of trade. So trans-border food safety involves the Department of Transportation, border security, and other folks who have to be able to work trans-border on these issues. Medications and other countermeasures. We have to recognize that particularly with a border event, but also with many other events that could happen in any part of either country, medical facilities within those metropolitan areas will likely be overwhelmed very rapidly and not necessarily with major incidents. So we have to recognize that mutual aid trans-border has to be possible, that there are medications that are licensed in one country and not the other, that we cannot just take a physician from New York and put them in New Jersey. We can't take a physician from one hospital in a city and necessarily put them in another hospital if they haven't been credentialed. In the United States, the states actually license physicians, so it is each state, each jurisdiction. We have laws for hospitals that mandate that they can't take credentials from a secondary source. They must get all of their medical credentialing, healthcare credentialing from the original source, from the medical school, from the testing boards, et cetera. This was put in place to prevent fraudulent practitioners. But as a result, this has created obstacles in emergency response for us to be able to work together without worrying about licensing, indemnification, and liability issues. In addition, vaccine development is clearly an international issue. We have a variety of vendors outside the United States from whom we want to be able to look to for various solutions. And for that reason, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States has a program now for looking in advance at potential producers or producers of vaccines for good manufacturing process, et cetera, so that these can be generally pre-approved and there won't be problems in getting licensing or trans-border shipment. Another major issue is that of quarantine or isolation. The Centers for Disease Control, along with the Department of Health and Human Services, has further defined this, particularly with SARS. But there are obviously legal and political ramifications to this, and we are engaged at a scientific as well as other levels of discussion determining whether quarantine in today's society would even be effective. But we are working with Health Canada and other groups within Canada on emergency response plans, understanding cross-border outbreaks, how we would look at surveillance, how we would respond together, international health regulation issues, how do we medically screen visitors to our countries who fly in on a jet and they have a fever or chills or something like that. How do we assess these people for illnesses that may pose a hazard? Other issues of cooperation have included West Nile virus and other vector-borne diseases. PulseNet North is a laboratory-based surveillance for foodborne illnesses in which the United States and Canada share information. All of these programs, or many of them, had some small beginnings even before 9/11. But since 9/11, many of these sort of dual-purpose programs, both accidental, naturally occurring disease issues, have merged with counterterrorism issues. And we've seen a much more robust development of cooperation and science and technology to try and answer these issues. During the SARS problems. In Toronto, we saw a spread of disease throughout hospitals and hospital workers. And in this respect, the National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health, part of CDC, was able to respond and assist in looking at protective measures for these sorts of situations for hospital workers and also for cleanup workers to sites. Issues that are transnational include water safety issues, monitoring of water, and we also have to have ability, as we have recently done, in notifying our partners as to what health policy statements we may be coming out with so that other groups can respond. We recently came out with some new guidance on pediatric care for some issues, and we sent these provisions to the Canadian Society of Pediatrics so that they were aware of any changes that the U.S. was promulgating. Another program, just briefly to mention, is the vessel sanitation program that looks at cruise ships. And this is another issue we've seen a lot in the news, people who have had more or worse of a vacation than they had planned on recently, coming back with Norwalk virus and other things that have really been debilitating and messy. So we do also look at this program, including those vessels that transit between Canada and Alaska. Most recently, we had an exercise called Global Mercury. Now, being rather concrete, I thought this was going to be some major mercury exposure. It was not. It referred to the god of Mercury in communication. And this was an exercise looking at a large influenza outbreak that was international and how we would respond, looking mostly at communications issues. And it was a success in demonstrating our failures, our gaps. I think that's the way you put things positively. At all levels, we recognized the need to increase communications. We have, as a result, developed specific plans how in an emergency, people from Health Canada or other agencies would deploy to the United States, to those collateral agencies to sit in their command centers, and we would send representatives as liaison to Health Canada or elsewhere, so we would have much better communications and understanding of operational plans. Issues of stockpiling of medications, how can we share these things cross borders? Sister cities programs working together with their plans, such as Detroit and Windsor. The needs for communications, the exchange of liaison personnel have all been very important, as well as the recognition of intellectual property transfers here are an issue for those who have a vested interest in some of these. We also need to look at, as people have mentioned earlier, issues with visas. In an emergency, we suspect that visa process and transborder visits will be constrained. Well, how do we get scientists in an emergency that we need to these locations? We need to make sure that we have a process to expedite visas for public health emergencies. Medical practice and harmonization, as I said, we need to have physicians who can work across borders and a variety of these other things. We are working very closely through these specific collaborations with Canada, sharing these plans, sharing personnel, looking critically at how we would work together with food, with agricultural products, and a variety of safety issues. So this has a challenge for us as science technology people who are not accustomed necessarily to looking at all the ramifications, legal, cultural, and otherwise, and now having to broaden our perspectives to recognize that a good public health infrastructure will support us all, regardless of the emergency, but making sure that it is seamless, that it recognizes that these threats will cross borders, and that we will have to cross borders in our planning and interventions. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Let me suggest that we regroup a few of these questions. Panelists will take notes of the questions, and then we'll fire back with answers. Who would like to ask the first question? Lady here. I don't know where the microphone is on it. It's coming.
Thank you. My name is Judith Costello. I'm in a possibly unique, or at least unusual position of being a U.S. citizen whose salary is paid by the government of Canada. So this is very interesting, this entire conference to hear perspectives from both sides. All of that actually has nothing to do with my question, which is directed at Ambassador McNamara. I was very intrigued with your analogy, your parallels that you drew between Al-Qaeda and similar terrorist groups and the mafia. But I guess most analogies sooner or later break down or at least diverge. And what occurs to me is that in the traditional mafia setup, there is an implied, if not explicit, quid pro quo in terms of protection, the traditional protection racket, in terms of risk-taking for provision of products and services such as, at different times, alcohol, drugs, gambling, prostitution, etc. And I don't see that those issues of quid pro quo apply. If it does, I'd be very interested to know where that element of the parallel would come in, if you could address that.
Okay, anybody else wants to ask questions? Joseph Galsky back there. Front here, I'll take one more.
I'm Joseph Galsky with the Royal Military College of Canada. The comment and the question. The comment is that a lot of, and I think this is in the literature, a lot of what countries do about border security is psychological assurance to their citizens. What the United States has to do to assure its citizens that the border is secure makes the Canadian government nervous, which in turn says things to assure the United States government, which makes the Canadian public nervous. But below that level, the cooperation continues and intensifies. My question is for Wesley Wark. In terms of the lessons learned, regarding the intelligence services in Canada, CSIS, RCMP, and the Canadian Security Intelligence Establishment, are you satisfied that the existing arrangement is effective, particularly if, in light of what we've heard today, the threats are going to come internally rather than across the border?
Thank you, Joe. A question for each panelist. That's wonderful. Charles-Philippe.
I appreciate it very much that in this panel about counter-terrorism, no one spoke about war, but we spoke about what I think is the appropriate answer, which is intelligence and cooperation. And and certainly this is a big part of the answer. Perhaps one element which I missed is how to dry up the breeding ground for the terrorists. I'm not an illusionary who thinks that in combating poverty in the world we will dry up the sympathy for terrorists, or that Al-Qaeda would not fight if there was just an international economic system. But I simply wonder why no one makes the connection with U.S. policy cities perceive the problem, and I have experienced that with my students in Montreal or in Quebec, that unfortunately many of them are very much against the United States international politics. And if this is possible in Canada and in Switzerland, where they do not have a lot of objective reasons, how shall it be in the Middle East, where they perceive the United States always with Israel? How shall it be in Iraq, where they perceive themselves as being occupied and so on? There, I think this is another way we should think about counter-terrorism, not necessarily happening foreign policy of the United States, but perhaps to selling it differently, because that's also homeland defense. For instance, not giving yesterday the impression that the United States are for the first time agreeing with settlements in the equator. Thank you.
don't know who you're addressing your question to, but perhaps the ambassador will. One last question I can take if someone urgently wants to ask a question before. There's a gentleman here, I think, who was rising timidly, now certainly his hand. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Andre Bellew. I am a colleague of Chris's at the Center for Strategic International Studies and actually a former student of Wesley's as well, University of Toronto. My question is for Philip, however. I enjoyed your remarks on the public health side, and I was just wondering, very short question, what you would think of the creation of something like a North American CDC.
Okay, your question. Thank you very much. We'll go perhaps by order of questions if you want.
With respect to the mafia quid pro quo, I specifically mentioned that it was religiously motivated. It is not monetarily motivated. That is to say, the reward is not the money. The reward will be given to them by Allah. It is not a type of, it's not a full mafia in the sense that it's looking for earthly rewards. And that makes it at one and the same time different, but also more difficult to deal with. What I was talking about in terms of the mafia was the structure and the operations of the organization, not the motivation of the organization. We could go into more detail there. It is not, it is mafia-like, or at least it is becoming mafia-like. I wanted to stress what I said in my remarks, and that is we're in a period of transition in our, the Al-Qaeda is in a period of transition, and it hasn't yet transitioned completely. How it is actually going to come about, or what is the final outcome, is yet to be seen. That's something that hasn't occurred yet. With respect to the, I guess, how you're going to dry up the terrorist, the source of the terrorism, that is the old and not yet fully and adequately answered question of the root causes. You said nobody thinks or has mentioned in any event that U.S. policy is part of that problem. Well, I don't see anybody in the U.S. government that works on terrorism, including when I was in government, that didn't agree that U.S. policies were part of the reason why the terrorists were undertaking their terrorism against the United States. However, it doesn't explain why they're conducting their terrorism against countries other than the United States. There, I think there are more fundamental motivations behind their terrorism, and that has to do with very basic, very fundamental senses of alienation from their own societies, from various social, political, economic causes within their own societies. But nobody that I know of who works on terrorism, either in the U.S. government or I think probably outside, U.S. policies, particularly in the Middle East, are a causative factor. And I also agree that changing the policies is not going to, it may alter the nature of the terrorism, it may alter some of the targets of the terrorists, but I think the terrorists are motivated by much more fundamental problems than the single issue of U.S. policy or U.S. policy in the Middle East. And I fully agree with you that the United States has done an atrocious job in, I don't want to say selling its policies, but in explaining its policies in the Middle East in a manner that is effective. I don't know, I'm not a specialist in the area of public diplomacy, and therefore I'm not going to offer any solutions off the top of my head, but I do recognize that our inability to explain our policies effectively in the Muslim world is a great defect.
Thank you, Ambassador Wesley.
In specific response to Joel's question, it's a fascinating question. It's a good question. I thank him for their answers. I think that since September 11th, the Canadian government has got some things right and recognized many of the problems that exist and is working on change. But in the course of working on change, I think that there are issues to do with capacity and questions of who is in charge of what that still fundamentally remain to be resolved. Just to give you one example on capacity, prior to September 11th, Canada had a signals intelligence agency called the Communication Security Establishment, linked into its allied signal agencies in the US, UK, Australia. But CSE, prior to September 11th, astonishingly, had no counterterrorism mission or mandate. It was given one in Bill C-36 very explicitly as part of a general process of enabling legislation. The question has to be, why did it take so long, and how good is CSE at this new and very difficult task? I think that's a good question because we continue to look to kind of the technological spectrum of intelligence gathering for some of the answers in counterterrorism field. I think Canada, and it's interesting in the context of the debate that has now been reawakened in the United States about who best does domestic security intelligence or counterterrorism intelligence. Canada, back in the mid-1980s, decided that it would separate its police law enforcement agency, take it out of that field of operations and create instead a civilian security intelligence service called CSIS. That decision was taken on two kinds of, I think, fundamental understandings. One is that the police agencies are not necessarily very good at understanding some complex political issues, the sort that you find emerging in terrorism cases. And the other was that there might be good operational reasons for having a civilian agency as opposed to a law enforcement agency with different sort of cultures and rules that apply dealing with such investigations. Nevertheless, that separation of powers, which was once very clear, has been blurred since September 11th in ways which I think are very alarming and probably are at the heart of, among many things at the heart of our problem. The RCMP has come back into the world of counter-terrorism and security intelligence. And while CSIS and the RCMP put the best possible official public face on this, I don't believe that this is a comfortable situation. We have to go back to the drafting table and decide who's in charge of what in that particular field. You mentioned watch lists in my own talk. I think this is another area among many, including, for example, weapons of mass destruction and proliferation, where there are a number of agencies still with a partial mandate to deal with these agencies, but no real lead and no real coordination. And some of these remarks have something mirroring what the Auditor General has to say. I think the thing that I find most heartening in the Canadian response to present the other side of the story since September 11th are two areas. One is that prior to September 11th, the idea that the government had, that the government should devote significant resources to something called intelligence assessment was never really recognized. We had a number of departments doing intelligence assessment at various times, but it wasn't a high-level activity. I think September 11th, the notion that intelligence assessment is at the heart of counterterrorism is now fully recognized, even if not if all the institutional ramifications of that haven't been sorted out. The other thing I think that's very important that's happened in Canada, although it may strike our allies as remarkable, is that since September 11th, we have achieved a system finally in which intelligence goes to the top. That intelligence is seen to serve senior decision makers at the cabinet level and in the prime minister's office, which was not always the practice by any means before September 11th, and the institutional structures to make that happen weren't in place before September 11th. So we've had a new understanding that wise policy can only be made on the basis of good intelligence. That understanding, I think, is crucial. I'm not sure that we're all the way there in terms of the capacity to generate good intelligence. I'm sure we're not. But even that lack, I think, is now recognized in ways that are simply would have been impossible to imagine before September. Just a comment on the other question, Mr. Chairman, I've got a question for the root causes. We had a Canadian Prime Minister who was very fond of talking about root causes of terrorism, particularly annoying to his American counterparts. I think many of us never knew quite what he meant by that. Perhaps he didn't either. I think what we're witnessing is, in fact, a fascinating historical dynamic in which there is a contest developing between the appeal of globalization of culture, and American culture in particular, and the anger directed at specific American policies, and how that contest will work out between the global appeal of an American-driven popular culture and American policies. How that will work out is anybody's guess, but I would have, if it was my business to give advice to the American government, I would say, well, that's your challenge, and see what you can do to lessen the anger of American policies, and see what you can do, and this is the Joe Nye's point about soft power, see what you can do about boosting the real appeal of this globalizing cultural moment.
Sorry, we just have a few minutes left.
And question concerning North American CDC. Thank you very much for the excellent question. We are, in fact, one of the things that we didn't have time to talk about is our efforts at CDC in working with Health Canada and its agencies in setting up a commensurate organization using the excellence in Canada to develop a sister-type agency. The reality to remember is CDC in the U.S. only, or almost only, responds to incidents at the invitation of the local or state health department. We don't have primary responsibility to go there. Public health is a local issue. They will be the first ones to know about an incident, an outbreak, whatever. Even if it's coming in by plane, it will be the local health department that responds. So we support those local, state, tribal, and other health services. And I think the same needs to be with Canada. They're going to need to support provincial and metropolitan health departments as well in order to be effective. The real challenge is not just North America, as we've seen with SARS and other diseases coming out of other parts of the world, but working with WHO, working with the European Union, working with PAHO, working with all different international groups to help support those intelligence and infrastructure needs. So I think the challenge is the development of entities that can monitor, that can help, that can assist, knowing what's going on in localities, and developing communication systems that have secure data capabilities, that respect privacy, that respect all the other needs to make them acceptable to the various governments and populations to accept them. And these networks need to be maintainable, so you have a virtual worldwide CDC, if you will.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Delman, and thank you, Christopher Sands, Wesley Wark, Ambassador McNamara, on your behalf. Thank you very much for this panel. Very interesting.
Thank you, Charles-Philippe, for that. For those of you who are joining us for lunch, we will be starting the lunch at 12:45 sharp. And it is, as you go out the back doors, about 3 doors down, you'll see our sign on it. And again, we'll be starting the luncheon at 12:45. We have a program, an exchange between Gordon Giffen and Lloyd Axworthy. And because Gordon has to leave at 2 o'clock to catch a flight, we need to stay on schedule. So join me at 12:45 if you're with us for lunch.